Welcome to this online training on how to become the best critical thinker in your workplace. I'm Matt Plummer, the CEO of Zarvana, and I'm really excited that you're here with us today to talk about this hugely important topic. I'm guessing that if you joined, you already believe that critical thinking is a really valuable skill to invest in. But I do want to just take a few minutes up front to emphasize its importance. The data shows us that those with higher critical thinking skills are able to secure jobs with higher skill requirements. They're also able to retain those jobs for longer periods of time, and they're better prepared for the future. Data from ZipRecruiter, an online employment marketplace, showed that in just the time from 2017 to 2018, the percent of jobs that were requiring critical thinking skills increased by 70%. And we know that as automation, AI continues to do more of what humans used to do, critical thinking will become even more and more important. But here's the thing, critical thinking doesn't just prepare you for success on the job or in your career, it also prepares you for success in life. In fact, research shows that those with higher critical thinking skills have fewer negative life events than those with lower skills. Not only that, but critical thinking was a stronger predictor of the number of negative life events than IQ. What that means is that the quality of your life depends more on your critical thinking skills than the IQ that you were born with. That should be good news. But at the same time, what we find is that most people are lacking in strong critical thinking skills. And that's not just my opinion. In fact, 60% of managers say that critical thinking skills is the number one gap in recent graduates. 84% of senior managers say that their organization has suffered loss because of the absence of critical thinking in their workforce. That makes critical thinking a huge opportunity for you and for me. On one hand, critical thinking is hugely valuable to the work that pretty much anyone does. And on the other hand, it's really lacking, creating the perfect opportunity for you to distinguish yourself and stand out. Now, the problem is that most people don't take an intentional approach to critical thinking. Congratulations to you for being here because you're already doing that. But the problem has been that most people think that critical thinking is either some innate gift that you're just born with or you're not, or they think that it's just learned through experience. Without really any intentionality, just do your job and you'll get better at it over time. Neither of those puts you in control over the quality of your critical thinking. And we didn't like that, so we did some research on the models that define critical thinking in academia and practical applications. And what we were able to conclude from that is that we can put together 4 phases that lead you on the journey to exceptional critical thinking. We describe these in the critical thinking roadmap. And these 4 phases are: first, execute, which is basically, can you do what you're asked to do? Can you translate instructions into actions? Next is synthesize, which means can you identify what's important and can you interpret it? Can you determine what is meant by the information? The third phase is recommend, which essentially means can you determine a sensible path forward through consideration of alternatives? And finally, the 4th phase is generate. Generate is, can you produce previously uncharted paths forward that illuminate the answers to problems or challenges? It's about creativity. So those 4 phases: execute, synthesize, recommend, and generate, lay out the roadmap to exceptional thinking. In the toolkit on this roadmap, we described 5 milestones for each of those 4 phases so that you can figure out where are you on this journey to exceptional critical thinking. That, hopefully, if you've seen that already, you can plot yourself on there, you know roughly where you are. Or if you're using this to grow your team skills, you can do the same for your team members. From there, we also said, for each of those 5 milestones in each phase, here's a development exercise that you can take and begin to develop either your own skill or your team member's skills. Now, that was just a starting point. That was essentially the skeleton that helps you frame up this journey and helps you understand what the path forward is. What we're going to do over the next hour is walk through each of those 4 phases in detail and describe the skills that are required and what it takes to develop those. We'll also spend time on the transitions between those phases, because what I've found is that people commonly get stuck as they're moving from one phase to the next. For example, from execute to synthesize. These are what I call the critical thinking plateaus, where people can get stuck and never move on. And so I want to make sure that you understand what those are and that you know how to get out and over those. So that's what we have in store. We also are going to have time to take your questions at the end, and I'm going to make a special announcement of an opportunity that we are excited to present just to you guys for the first time. And so that's what's in store. Let's get started with the first phase, execute. All right, phase 1, execute. Here we go. Execute, again, is about translating instructions into action. Can you do what you're asked to do? There are a few different components of that we describe in the milestones. So first is a matter of comprehensiveness. That means if you were asked to do 3 things, do you do all 3 things? The next is a matter of quality. So can you do it at the quality level that's expected of you? Otherwise, it's not executing. And then the third level is timeliness. Can you do it on time, in the time that's allotted for it? So those 3 things of comprehensiveness, quality, and timeliness are things that you have to nail to master the execute phase. So let's start with comprehensiveness. How do you ensure that you are comprehensive in the work that you're doing? Well, it starts with making sure that you understand what you're being asked to do. Now, understanding, you might be like, oh, that seems so simple. But actually, a lot of times, people think they understand what they're supposed to do, but then go on to misinterpret what was originally asked. Miscommunication is one of the leading causes of project failures and delays. And so this is a big deal. So how do you understand? Make sure that you understand what's being asked of you. Make sure that the people that you're managing understand. So the way to do that is to ask questions. Now that might sound simple, but here's the thing. Only about half of employees feel comfortable asking questions, voicing, sharing what's on their minds. Only 1% are extremely confident voicing concerns. And so that becomes a huge problem, because if you're told to do something, but you don't feel comfortable asking a question because you think it's going to make you look bad, then your ability to understand that is going to go way down. And so big encouragement here is build the confidence to ask questions when you don't understand, or even when you do. A great way to ensure that you're understanding something is to re-articulate it to the person who shared it with you. Try to say it in your own words. That gives them an opportunity to be like, oh, wait, yeah, no, you're not getting that. And sometimes it even refines their own thinking. So that's what I call the re-articulation test. So that's the first part of being comprehensive, is make sure you actually understand what is being told. The next thing is that you have to remember it. Again, we're starting simple, but bear with me, because a lot of people don't get this right. And here's the thing about memory. A lot of times we force our minds to do it when our minds are actually not super good at remembering a lot of details. In fact, you'll probably, the data suggests that you'll forget 70% of what I share with you today, unless you're rehearsing it or taking notes, in 24 to 48 hours. And so you can't trust your mind to remember what you have to do. You have to write it down. And the best way, if you're doing something that has multiple steps, is to create a checklist or a to-do list of sorts. We talk a lot about this in other places. But a checklist, so if you're doing especially a repeated task, making a checklist is hugely valuable. Atul Gawande, who wrote the book The Checklist Manifesto, found that when surgeons were using checklists to do something that they were really gifted to do and really knew how to do, so it's not like, when we're saying use a checklist, it's not a demeaning thing. So when surgeons were doing that, it improved patient outcomes by 30%. That's dramatic. And it will do the same thing for you if you're not doing that already, because you can't rely on your mind to remember these things. So that's how you improve either your own or your team members' ability to deliver on the comprehensiveness of an assignment, is you help them understand and then remember it. Next is quality. Quality starts with understanding the standard that's being set for you. Now, what that means basically is that you understand what the final product should look like, that you have a grasp of the level of quality that you need to hit. And when someone first starts a job, or when you first start a role, you don't have that sense. You have no way to determine that except based on past experience. And there are basically two ways to learn and create your own standard of quality. One is from looking at other benchmarks. So that could be other coworkers, other clients, etc. The other is from having an understanding of what the ultimate product or service or whatever it is intended to do. So understanding what the end user or the end beneficiary of whatever you're doing needs and wants. And that can help you understand, okay, well, if they need this, then I know I need to deliver at that quality level. And so here's the thing. When you're trying to develop your quality standard that you're trying to hit, you want to set your standard 5 to 10% higher than the standard of your boss or your clients. If you set it right equal to that, what you're going to have happen is sometimes you'll be a little bit lower than them, and sometimes you'll be a little bit over. But you want to avoid being under their standard of quality. So you want to set yours a little bit higher than your boss, than your clients. So let me give you a few examples of how this can work out. When I was at a consulting firm, we were regularly making PowerPoint slide presentations. And so what I would do is, and what I did myself, and then what I told my team members, young team members, to do, is I said, go on our intranet, where all past casework was stored. And I said, just find really good slide decks, as we call them, and just go through them and review them. It doesn't even matter if you understand the context of what's there. I just want you to begin to ingrain in yourself what a good slide looks like, what it feels like, what it sounds like when you read it. And that was a way of taking a benchmark for these young folks and helping them begin to develop a quality standard. So here's what you can do. You can find those people who you know are doing well and try to work with them. It might mean volunteering to help them in some small way. It might be volunteering to, copy edit or zero defect, kind of review their work at the very end to make sure there aren't any small mistakes. But get around them, get to work with them so you're exposed to their work. That will make a huge difference. Also, again, look for benchmarks wherever you can find them. If you have an intranet or elsewhere where you can find these benchmarks and begin to just immerse yourself in great work. Also, pay attention to people who are receiving praise and work that is receiving praise. When a piece of work receives praise, that should kick off an alarm in your head that says, I need to investigate this. What was good about this work? What can I copy? What's the difference between my work and their work? And that will help you set a quality standard that is going to allow you to execute with excellence. That's number 2, quality. The third piece is around timeliness. So timeliness, there's 3 components to that. In order to deliver work on time, first you have to know how long things will take you. Then you need to develop a plan that allows you to allot that time in order to get it done. And then third, you actually have to stick with the plan. So how do you determine how long things will take you? Well, the best way, and really the only way in the research that has been correlated, the only project management tool that has been correlated with on-time delivery of projects is what's called the cost analogous tool, which basically is a tool that says, okay, if this cost me this much time, this task that I did previously, how does that task compare to my current task? And then I use that as a benchmark, and I adjust the amount of time it would take to predict how much time this current task will take. And so basically you're looking back on prior work that either you've done or others have done, and then building your estimate based on that. And so that's a starting point. It's also, there's a number of ways to do this. You can put blocks on your calendar for when you're going to be doing certain tasks, and then actually, say you have it blocked an hour, and then it's like, oh, well, that actually took me an hour and a half, and you make note of that in the calendar invite. And that's a way to begin to learn this over time too. So there's a number of ways to do it, but you need to begin to get better at understanding how long things will take you. From there, you develop what I would call a work plan. And a work plan starts with understanding the tasks that are required in order to complete the final deliverable. And so you have to make a list of all the tasks that are required. And then what you do is you start at the end with the last task. And you say, okay, when is this deliverable due? So you start there, you figure your ultimate deadline, and then you actually work your way backwards towards the front with setting intermediate deadlines for each of those subtasks until you get to the very first task. And this enables you to ensure that that by getting done that first task on time, you're actually setting yourself up for success to hit that final deadline. That's the goal of a work plan. And that will help you ensure that you're allotting the appropriate amount of time to get something done on time. Now, you might have done all that perfectly, but then when it comes to actually putting it into action, you don't stick with the plan. A lot more can be said about this, but here's what I want to say about it right now, is that what you need to do is take your plan and put it, the plan, which usually might take the form of a to-do list or, in this case, a work plan, and you need to translate that into your calendar and actually block the time on your calendar. Because once it's blocked on your calendar, there's a pretty good chance you're actually going to do it. And that's what matters here. And once you've blocked it on your calendar, which I would suggest is a daily process of blocking out the full day of what you're going to do that day, then do something that I would call a calendar priority sync. Sometimes we go through that exercise and we fill our calendar all up. And then when we realize that, we're like, oh, I don't actually have time to do the things that are highest priority for me. And so the way to do that is to say, once you've scheduled out your whole day, is to say, what are my top 3 priorities for today? And then go back and look at your calendar and see, do I have enough time to achieve those priorities? Those few practices will help you increase the odds that you're actually going to stick with the plan that you set, and as a result, deliver things on time. So those are the 3 components that are necessary to execute with excellence and surpass this first phase of critical thinking. So that's a deep dive on execute, phase 1. Now let's take a minute, or actually more than a minute, and let's jump into the transition from execute to synthesize, phase 2. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to talk about the transition from phase 1, execute, to phase 2, synthesize. And here, I like to call what happens in between these phases, and all 4 phases, critical thinking plateaus. If you think of the critical thinking roadmap as an ascent, a journey upwards, a climb, then what can happen to people is that when they're trying to jump from the execute phase into the synthesize phase and the subsequent phases, they can get stuck there and level off and just stay there, sometimes for just a season, sometimes for a few years, sometimes for people's whole careers. They never are able to get up and over that plateau and continue the ascent. So this is hugely valuable. Between these first 2 phases is what I call the ownership plateau. Ownership is hugely powerful, and it's really about taking responsibility for the impact or the outcome of your work. Do you care about what happens with your work? Or are you just focused on doing what you've been asked to do? And when you're in the execute phase, it is about just doing what you've been asked to do. And so you can see that there would be a need to make a shift when you go into the synthesize phase. The way I like to describe this is to think about a dentist who has a patient come in, and the patient asks him, I have this infected tooth, can you take it out? The dentist goes in, he's taking the tooth out, and while he's doing it, he realizes that about 2 teeth away, there's another tooth that is similarly infected and that also needs to be removed. Now, the dentist who's operating in the execute phase of critical thinking doesn't do anything about that other tooth. He probably doesn't even tell the patient. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but that is what happens when we think that our job is only to do what we've been asked to do. Now, when someone moves into the synthesize phase, they need to be taking ownership for their work, because synthesis is rarely asked of you as the employee or team member, but always required, because it requires that you make sense of the information and identify what's important. And you're not always going to be asked to do that. So you have to do that in order to determine what is important and to own the outcome of the work. And so how do you cultivate ownership either in yourself or in your team? Now I'm going to talk through 3 bits of research that explain this. Clearly, this is more geared towards someone in a leadership position or a management position that can do this for their team, but I'm also going to try to explain how this can apply to you. So the first is something called the endowment effect. And the endowment effect was demonstrated by research where, among other things, they did one experiment where they gave one group a mug as a reward for doing a certain part of the experiment. And then they gave another group chocolate. And then they asked them, okay, do you want to trade? If you have the mug, do you want the chocolate? And vice versa. And what they found is that the group who they gave the mug to basically wanted to stick with the mug. And the group that they gave the chocolate to wanted to stick with the chocolate when presented with the mug. And they switched this around a few times. And what they found is that, for the most part, whenever someone was given something first and seemed to be in possession of it, they were really hesitant to part with it. They actually began to take ownership for it. And so what we can learn from there is that if you think of what you're doing as being part of who you are and part of your role and part of your responsibility, that you are going to take pride in that, and you're going to hold on to that, and you're going to want to invest in that. And so just changing your mindset and changing how people think, if you're a team leader and you can actually give people a responsibility for something and say, hey, this is yours, this work stream, this task, this is yours. Even just using that language and framing that language that can help people think, oh, this is mine. That changes things and creates that endowment effect. Another example comes from Japanese auto manufacturing. And when the US first began to investigate and explore what was happening in Japan, partially because the Japanese automakers were, trying to create some plants in the US, they found that there was huge differences in how they approached their assembly plants. And in the US auto manufacturers at the time, there was, basically a taboo against the people working on the line. So, car parts are going by and they're helping assemble in them. And there was a taboo about stopping that line, because the idea was that we want to keep that line going. We don't, any stop is slowing down and reducing the output of the factory. In Japan, in contrast, they gave everyone who was on the front line authority to stop the line at any time and fix an error that they saw going by. And the difference that it created is that in the US plants, there were, people would see something wrong with a car going by, but they didn't have any authority to make a difference and to actually stop it and change it and fix it. And this created vastly different cultures in terms of the feel and the environment of the workplace, and also in the quality of the output of, the cars that were created. And what was done there was it was actually taking people who are on the front lines, who are involved in the work, and giving them decision-making authority. They had the ability to influence how they did the work that they were doing. They even did things like letting them set up their workspaces in the ways that they wanted to. And here's an important thing about ownership is you have to give people the decision-making rights for the things that you want them to own. If you retain all the decision-making rights, then they will create a gap in ownership and a vacuum there. And so in your own, as you're thinking like, well, I can't assign myself decision-making rights. You can't, but you can think about when you're given a task, what things can I control? What decisions can I make? And be intentional about looking for ways that you can influence it and leave your unique footprint on that and unique bit of ownership. And that will create and instill in you a sense of agency, which is strongly associated with ownership. The third piece of research that I want to comment on that will help you get over the ownership plateau is research that was done on startup cultures. And they found that there was 5 different startup cultures. And one of those, the one that turned out to be the most successful by far, was what they called the commitment culture. The commitment culture was a culture where the leadership really valued the people and did what they could to, avoid laying them off, did what they could, it was the type of environment where, when things got hard, they would send a text and say, I know things are tough right now. We're going to push through this. We're going to keep going. And there was a sense that people had each other's backs and they were doing something as part of a bigger vision, part of a bigger whole. Now, most people might think that investing in people, when it made more sense to lay them off, making changes like that would actually have resulted in inferior business outcomes and more time wasted. But the opposite was true, that when people knew that the leadership, when those around them had their back and that they were part of something bigger, they felt like they belonged. And that, when you feel like you belong, it instills a sense of ownership in you. And so creating a commitment culture in your team, in your workplace, actually creates an environment where ownership can flourish. Again, that might be difficult for you as an individual if you're not in a position of leadership to influence, but it is worth thinking about. Can you create a community or a context or a group within your workplace where you can belong and feel that sense of ownership? So the ownership plateau is really important, that when you're trying to make the jump, that you understand that that is a place where you can get stuck, and you think about things like the endowment effect, things like the ability to pull and stop the assembly line, and the decision-making rights, and also a commitment culture, so that you don't get stuck there in the execute phase, but you're able to move on to synthesize. All right, let's jump into phase 2, synthesize. When we talk about synthesize, we're talking about 4 skills. The first is pattern recognition. The second is categorization, or putting things into categories. The third is identifying relevance of information. And the fourth is decoding significance. To summarize that, basically we're talking about 2 things. How do you make sense of a lot of information and determine the meaning or interpret it? And then 2, how do you identify what's important in that information? So let's start with that first, of how do you make sense of a lot of information? If you think about it, today we are inundated with more information than we have been at any point in history. In fact, the research shows that today we consume 5 times the amount of information that we consumed in 1986 on a daily basis. And so the skill of making sense of information, lots of information, is hugely critical. To unpack this a little bit, I want you to enter into a little bit of a thought experiment with me. So in the Hebrew Bible, they talk about the account of Noah, who God told him that he was going to flood the earth and said, okay, I want you to build a huge boat that they call an ark, and we're going to put the animals in there so that when the flood happens, they're safe, and then after the flood, they can go back onto the earth and return to life. Now, I want you to imagine that you are Noah for this example, and I want you to think about, how would you think about designing this huge boat to house the animals? Like, what types of housing quarters do you need? How would you arrange those and design those? Where would they feed? Where would they go to the bathroom? All those types of things are questions that you would have to answer. Well, if I were you in this example, I would start by looking at patterns in the types of animals. So you might say, well, all these animals have wings, and so those are flying animals, so we should put them together. Or, these animals are all really big, like elephants, giraffes, and so we're going to have to design certain housing quarters for those types of animals versus the small ones. What you're doing is you're looking for similarities in the information. There's 8.7 million species of animals today. There's no way that your mind can make sense of that much information. In fact, what research in psychology shows us is that our short-term or our working memory is capable of holding about 7 pieces of information in our mind at one time. 8.7 million versus 7, big difference. So how do we enable our working memory to actually work with the right amount of information? What we have to do is we look for patterns, and then patterns lead us to create categories. And then when we create categories of information, we take what was, millions and millions of pieces of unique information, and we group it into a more limited number of chunks of information that then we can begin to work with and process. When you're reviewing and consuming information, you want to be doing the same thing. You want to be looking for patterns. Patterns are cases of similarities, and there's a few different ways to think about it. There may be similarities in terms of features. So in the case of animals, it's like, okay, these all have wings. Or there might be similarities in terms of characteristics. So, these are all tall, or these are all short, or these are all heavy or light, And then there might be similarities in terms of the relationships. So, we could say that certain animals are prey to other animals who are predators. And so they have a distinct type of relationship there that we would want to be conscious of if we're designing a boat to house all of them, to go back to that example. And then there's also, you can think about similarities in terms of sequence. So if you were to say, okay, a tadpole, which is a baby frog, right, has a certain unique relationship and pattern to a frog because there's a sequential relationship there of a tadpole precedes a frog. And so that's important to know. And then the last thing and way to look for patterns is to say, okay, there's obviously a literal pattern or a literal similarity, but there might also be metaphorical similarities. So an example here is, if you're reading something and it talks about mules, and then it also talks about stubbornness, that would be something that could be a metaphorical similarity. So, because, mules are considered to be stubborn, it's kind of, at least in the folklore, that's kind of the conception. There might also be analogies that are illuminated as we look for patterns. So, for example, you might say, a eagle is to a mouse as a lion is to a zebra. And this is really important in work. I mean, I know this feels a little abstract because we're talking about animals, unless you happen to be a veterinarian, but what we're talking about is actually super relevant, because if you can identify patterns in the trends in your industry of like, oh, this is happening here, and this is actually analogous to what happened 10 years ago, or this is analogous to what is happening in this other industry that is completely different, then you can all of a sudden make sense of information. You can say, that's what this means. The fact that this is happening here, we know that that similar thing happened over here, and we can learn that what happened here actually can influence how we interpret and think about what is happening over here. And so it's really relevant to be able to understand and recognize patterns and then categorize information in a meaningful way. What I used to do as a consultant, where essentially, your job is it's like, okay, you have 2 weeks and try to get to know and understand your client better than they understand themselves, when they've been living, in their day-to-day job for X number of years. And so you have to get smart quickly. You have to consume a whole bunch of information and make sense of it. And what I would do is I would begin reading through, usually we would receive some documentation that would help us begin to understand the client. And we would read it, and I would read it through. And what I would do is I would take, as I'm reading through, anything that struck me as interesting, important, relevant, I would take that information and I would copy it and just paste it into a slide in a PowerPoint presentation. And, as I'm just throwing things on slides. But then as I keep going, I begin to recognize, oh, okay, this is all talking about a certain program that our client runs, or a certain product that our client offers. And so now I'm going to begin to include all that information about this product on this slide. Or this is all talking about a particular leadership challenge that I think will be relevant. And so I begin to include all of that. And I start identifying patterns as I go, so that by the end of my Get Smart period of a week or 2 weeks, I actually have a full PowerPoint presentation. Not that I'm going to be presenting it, but a full PowerPoint slide deck that has all this important information categorized into important topics. Not only does that make it easy to refer to, later on, but also now I have a deeper understanding and meaning of what's going on in the client because I now understand these categories of important information. A way to practice this is to say you have to read a research paper on something for some work you're doing. What I would ask you to do is take that, copy and paste everything that seems interesting to you into a separate document, and then after you're done reading it, go through and try to sort or categorize that information into categories. That process of sorting will begin to show you and teach you how to do pattern recognition and categorization at another level. So that's the first step of Synthesize, is recognizing patterns and interpreting those to understand what is meant. The next step is determining what is actually important. To do this, you have to start with an understanding of what your end goal is. So if I asked you, okay, we have a meeting, say you're at this training. If I asked you, okay, tell me the key takeaways from this training, what you would need to start with is an understanding of what was the objective of the training. If you don't know what the end goal is, you can't tell what was important from that. The same goes for any meeting that you might have in your workplace. If I ask you what the 3 most important things from that meeting was, if you don't know what the goal of that meeting is, you can't understand what is important to it. So understanding importance always starts with an understanding of what the end goal is and being super clear about that. From there, you can look at 4 dimensions of importance. So the first is what I would call magnitude of the effect. And let me actually use an example here. So imagine that you're about to interview a CEO, and you find out that that CEO is planning on selling her company in the next few years. Now, if you're doing an interview with the CEO about a breakthrough her company had around a particular innovation and product for some research paper on the technical details of that product, the fact that that CEO is planning on selling her company in a few years does not matter at all. It really doesn't. You're concerned with the technical details of the innovation. But if you're conducting a due diligence on this company to understand whether you want to invest or acquire this company in the next few years, then the fact that that CEO is interested in selling is hugely important. And so there we can see that what the end goal, your objective is, determines the importance of pieces of information. And so now if we were to think about the 4 dimensions of importance, starting with magnitude. So magnitude has to do with what is the size of the effect that that information will have on the end goal. And so again, if we were to take this example, the CEO, we know that the leadership of a company, the leadership team, is hugely important to the success of the company. And so if you're thinking about investing in it and there's a question of whether that leader will be there, the leader that has achieved the success to date, that has a huge magnitude. And so it's going to be really important. The next piece is around sequence or timing. So if you were to say, okay, we're thinking about investing in this company in the next 6 months to a year, and the information that you heard from the CEO is that that she's thinking about selling within the next 1 to 2 years, then that's hugely important because the timing aligns, and it's short term, it's immediate, it's relevant. But if you heard that CEO, oh yeah, I might sell the company in 10, 20 years, then that becomes much less important. So sequence and timing is important. The other piece is probability. And this makes intuitive sense, but if we were to say, okay, there's a 5% chance that the CEO will sell the company in the next 2 years. Not super important, that's probably true of any CEO. However, if I were to say, okay, no, the CEO is 90% sure that she's going to be selling the company, then that becomes hugely important. And so you can see that probability is really important in determining how important a piece of information is. The last thing, and it's a little less relevant here, but what is the relationship between that piece of information and the end goal? In some cases, there's going to be a causal relationship where that information actually will directly cause the end goal or not. In other cases, it will just be associated or correlated with that. And so if something is going to cause it, it's much more important than if it's loosely related. And so we want to look at the relationship between a piece of information and the end goal that you're trying to achieve. So looking at those 4 dimensions of the magnitude of it, the sequence or timing, the probability, and then the relationship can help you understand how important is this piece of information and allow you to decode the significance of it. So synthesize, super important. Phase 2, it's about making sense of information, and then it's about determining what is most important. Let's now turn and look at the gap between moving from synthesize to phase 3, which is recommend. All right, where most people get stuck between the synthesize phase, phase 2, and the third phase, recommend, is on what I call the egocentrism plateau. Egocentrism basically means that you can only see the world through one viewpoint, your own viewpoint. You can't see any alternatives. And if you think about it, up until this point, through the execute phase and the synthesize phase, basically you've assumed that either the instructions you were getting or the information that you're consuming was right, in a sense. In the execute phase, it's like someone gives you instructions, you say, okay, I'm going to act on these instructions. That's the job. It's implicitly assuming that that's right. In the synthesize phase, you're interpreting, you're understanding what does it mean. You're not evaluating it at that point to determine if it's true, accurate, etc. You're determining importance and you're determining meaning. And so up until this point, you haven't questioned the accuracy, the correctness of what you're doing. When it comes to recommending something, there we introduce this concept of evaluation. And if you can only see things through one viewpoint, then you're unable to make really sound recommendations. To make sound recommendations, you need to consider several alternatives. You need to investigate the weaknesses of your recommendation. And you also need to explore the strengths of the alternatives. And someone who gets stuck on the egocentrism plateau is only able to see things from one perspective. They aren't able to perceive the weaknesses in their own recommendations. They aren't able to view the strengths in the alternatives. So how do you overcome this plateau and continue the ascent to being a strong recommender? Well, first, it's understanding 2 biases, cognitive biases, the egocentric bias, which we've talked about a little bit, and confirmation bias. So confirmation bias, as you might know, is the tendency for us to seek out and pursue information that confirms what we already believe to be true. And so this goes hand in hand with the egocentric bias, because it basically means, okay, I have a perspective. This is the only way I can see the world. And so now I'm going to look for information that confirms what I already think. And it's kind of a reinforcing cycle that keeps you limited to a single perspective. How do you overcome these biases? Well, it starts with self-awareness. The first thing is knowing why and how you're thinking or feeling about a particular recommendation. And understanding of like, oh, I actually feel particularly drawn to this recommendation. So I might be only looking for information that will confirm that. Or, I really want to do option X. And so if I'm really passionate about option X, there's going to be even a greater likelihood that I'm going to fall prey to one of these 2 biases. And so understanding and being aware of what's going on internally and how you're experiencing the options is going to be super important. The other thing is to seek out opinions that are likely to be different than your own. So if we were to think about American politics, for example, as just a simple example, if you are, left-leaning Democrat liberal, it will be important for you to seek out perspectives from right-leaning Republican conservative thinkers, and so understand where your bias is, where your leaning is, and then seek out opinions of those on the other side, because that will actually enable you to provide sound recommendations. Beyond that, it's important to develop the skill of empathy. Because empathy basically means that you can see things from others' perspectives, and recognizing that, diversity, the diversity around us is enormous, and everyone has a unique perspective on how they view, particular options for a plan, or etc. And so if you can begin to tap into how other people might view your recommendation, then you're going to be able to see things from multiple perspectives and evaluate the strengths more objectively. How do you grow in empathy? First, it starts with active listening or interviewing when you're engaging with other people. So, if you're talking to me, I can kind of just be like, yeah. But if I'm really being active and I'm probing and I'm asking questions, then it's actually helping me understand, what are you thinking, versus just passively receiving the information that you're sharing. And so when you're listening to others, be active in how you're engaging with them. Ask questions, probe, understand, make them clarify things. Another way to grow in empathy is role playing. This might seem a little silly, but you can just do it as a thought experiment. You can say, imagine, you need to make a recommendation. Well, come up with a few different personas or archetypes of like, okay, here's the CEO of our company, here's the CEO of the client company, and here's an end user. And now I'm going to do a thought experiment where I put myself in the shoes, or the mental space of those three, and think about, okay, how would the CEO of my company think about this recommendation? How would the CEO of the client? How would the end user? And you can see that exercise will help you think about things in a different perspective and get out of your egocentric worldview. So that is how you can overcome the egocentrism plateau and move into a place where you're making sound recommendations that people actually trust and that will actually be more effective in your work environment. All right, let's now move into a deep dive on phase 3, recommend. All right, let's jump into phase 3, recommend. Recommend is about determining a sensible path forward, taking into consideration alternatives. Before I go into a bit more depth on a few of the skills that are required for recommending well, I want to give you 3 practices that will dramatically increase the quality of your recommendations. The first is to do something that we just talked about. Create 3 options. Anytime that you need to make a recommendation, I want you to come up with 3 recommendations. That alone will dramatically increase the quality of your recommendations by forcing you to think about different alternatives. Next, I want you to verbally or in written format make the case for your lead recommendation. Actually write it out. By putting it on paper or verbalizing it, it gives you an opportunity to experience your thinking on that in a way that you can't when it's stuck in your head. The third thing I want you to do is then make a case against your lead recommendation. This will allow you to expose weaknesses in your own thinking, which may ultimately cause you to shift your recommendation or just shore it up and strengthen it. So those 3 practices of make 3 recommendations, make a verbal or written case for it, and then make a case against it will, cause you to really step up in this area. Now let's talk about 4 skills that can help bring you to another level in your recommendations. The first is logical reasoning. Now, we could do a whole course on logic, and there's a lot to say there. It also can feel pretty abstract at times. What I want to say here is that logic kind of defines the bounds of what a sensible recommendation is. So if you are stepping outside of the bounds of logic, if you fall into something that's illogical, then you're probably going to be in dangerous territory. So think about logic as defining the bounds which you can operate and play in your mind. An example that I would give you in terms of let's make this concrete is, imagine a coworker were to say, our users must love this new feature because we haven't received any negative feedback on it. Now, that could be true, but it's not necessarily true. There are a number of other explanations for why, you may not have received any negative feedback on this new feature. And so that understanding that, the full set of explanations isn't defined by the absence of information. So let me say that another way. The absence of proof for something doesn't prove something. That would be the logical principle that shows why your coworker is not necessarily correct. And so understanding that logical principle is helpful in determining what really is happening there. How do you detect logical inconsistencies? What I would recommend is trying to put pen to paper here, because logic is often about connecting the dots and seeing the different relationships between pieces of information, and noticing that when in A plus B equals C, that actually you need D there, or something like that. And so try to put pen to paper. In this particular example, what I would do is I would say, okay, the assertion here is that, or what we know to be true is that users have not provided negative feedback on this new feature. So then I would say I'd draw an arrow up to there, and then I would create I'd draw a circle and say all possible explanations for why that is true. And when you do that, you quickly realize that the fact that users love the feature is really only one of the possible explanations for why that we haven't received any negative feedback on it. So that's a taste of logical reasoning. Again, there's a lot more to go there, but be sure that you're evaluating the logical consistencies of both your own recommendations and others. The next is probability. We talked about this a little bit in phase 2, but here what I want to do is give you some watch outs when it comes to probability. Probability might seem simple and intuitive, but oftentimes it can be deceptive. So as an example, say that we know that consumers are 30% likely to buy the 44mm Apple Watch. And at the same time, we know that consumers are 20% likely to buy the Apple Watch with a white band. Now, if I were to ask you, okay, what's the probability that they'll buy the 44mm watch with the white band? Some people might say, oh, well, it's 30%, which was the original probability of the 44mm, plus 20%. So it's 50% chance. Other people might say, well, actually, I think it might be the average of those two. And so it's actually an average of 30 and 20, which would be 25%. In reality, neither of those are the true probability. For both of them to occur at the same time, you need to multiply the probabilities together, which would be 6%, right? So dramatically different answer in terms of where you get to based on how you understand probability. And here's what I would say. When it's a probability of a single incident, 44mm watch, go ahead and move forward with that. But when you start moving into an area where you have multiple probabilities that you're trying to account for, that's where, one, you want to be putting things down on paper and pencil so that you actually can see what's going on there, and also be intentional about consulting some rules of probability. In particular, be very careful about and versus or relationships. So in the case of the example of the Apple Watch that I was just describing, we use the term and, which means that both conditions were happening. When you use and, you need to multiply the probabilities. When you use or, you add the probabilities. And so that's a really important distinction. Make sure you're being very thoughtful about which one to use in a particular instance. The point here is that probability can be tricky when you get into an area where you have more than one probability going on at the same time. The third skill here is evaluation. So evaluation is examining details, sources, data, and passing a judgment on it. When it comes to evaluation, there's a few things that are important. The first is having a robust set of criteria by which you're going to evaluate something. Research has shown that what the research was focused on was the crowdsourcing of ideas. So, there's hundreds, if not thousands of ideas out there. And when they have people just rank them in either a simple 5-star system or thumbs up, thumbs down, those rankings are not super helpful. What is necessary is to say, okay, rank these ideas on these 5 dimensions. And then you can use 5 stars or thumbs up, thumbs down. But unless you're defining what you're looking for when making an evaluation, your evaluation is likely to be unsuccessful. And that's what that research is showing. So first, define your criteria. Then you may want to think about, especially in terms of getting more complicated, is what is the relative importance of those criteria? So not all criteria might be same importance. So you might need to weight your criteria differently. So there, when you have your criteria that you're going to evaluate based on, and you have, a relative weighting of that criteria, that is employing a very rational, logical approach to evaluating decision. But it's also important to use your intuition, because our intuition, Malcolm Gladwell describes this in his book Blink, where we have two different ways of thinking going on. Similarly, Thinking Fast and Slow is another book that talks about this. One is a subconscious way of thinking that happens quickly and is intuitive, and the other is a very logical, deliberate form of thinking. What I just described is characteristic of this logical, deliberate way of thinking. But you do have another form of thinking that you want to take advantage of, because it's picking up on details and information that this way of thinking isn't capturing. And so it's actually important to use your intuition when evaluating. And what the research has found is that to make the fastest and best judgments, you want to use your intuition first and then employ a logical approach that we just described. So both are important. The fourth skill that I want to talk about in terms of recommend is decision making. Again, you could have courses and courses on decision making. What I want to do here is just highlight the fact that decision making goes wrong when we fall prey to some cognitive biases. And we've talked about two of those in the last Plateau. There are, tens of biases, many, many biases that we can fall prey to. What is key to that is both being self-aware, understanding what are you thinking or feeling about it, but also being aware of these biases. I had a friend who actually printed out the list of biases, and when he's making important decisions, he actually goes through them and makes sure, okay, am I falling prey to this one? Am I falling prey to that one? That might feel like a little bit overboard, but it's important to be aware of where you can fall into traps when it comes to decision making, and to be objectively critical of your own thought process to understand if you are in fact falling prey to that. So that's the recommend phase. We talked about our three kind of best simple practices up front, and then these four skills of logical reasoning, probability, evaluation, and decision making. Now let's talk about where people get stuck in between the recommend phase and the fourth and final phase, generate. All right, so where do people get stuck when they're trying to make the move from the recommend phase into the generate phase? Well, in my experience, people get stuck on what I call the creativity plateau. Meaning that if you think about it, up until this point, the last three phases basically are about taking information and working with it. So in execute, you're taking instructions, you're doing what you're told. In synthesize, you're making sense of information. And then in recommend, you're taking the next step forward, kind of one logical step beyond where you already are. Now, the difference when it comes to generate is that you're trying to create something, an idea, an answer, a solution out of nothing that doesn't follow logically from what has been done before. It's not the natural sequence or progression. And that requires a different way of thinking. It requires coming up with something new rather than building on or advancing something. And some people get stuck there and they're unable to make that jump into actually creating something new. One way that I like to describe it is to think of the difference between two different artists. So Gustavo Courbet was a naturalist or realist painter, meaning that what he basically did was he took the world around him and he conveyed it visually on the canvas. Picasso, on the other hand, who was an abstract painter, painter of Cubism, he was actually conceiving of and imagining new visual formations that weren't reflected, at least not in the way he portrayed them, in the world around him. And that is what we're trying to achieve when we make the jump from recommend to generate. We're trying to get you to operate in the Picasso world, where you're actually imagining and conceiving of new things. Now, that isn't always necessary. There's a lot of value in the recommend phase for most of the things that we're trying to do on a day-to-day, on the day-to-day. However, when you're working on trying to find solutions to intractable problems that haven't been solved before, or you're trying to do something at, say, a pace that hasn't been achieved before, or at a scale that hasn't been achieved before, then you actually need to operate in the generate phase. You can't rely on what has been done before as the natural building blocks. You can learn from it, but it can't be an immediate, progression from that. So how do you operate like a Picasso and conceive of new things? Well, one thing to do is to understand the two primary processes of creative thinking. And I'm not going to go into them now because when we do a deep dive on the generate phase, I'll talk more about them there. The other thing is to learn from icons like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and Mark Zuckerberg. What I find interesting about them is, all of them created businesses that have literally changed the world in the last few decades. But if you look at how they came up with their original idea, you might think we often have this perception of creativity that it's like you're just sitting there, or maybe, nowadays it's like you were standing at a whiteboard and boom, the idea hit and there you had it and like everything else changed. But if we look at, so Bill Gates, for example, how did the idea for Microsoft come to be? So his friend, Paul Allen, who became the co-founder of Microsoft, actually read an article about another, software-esque company at the time that needed some, and in that article illuminated a need that company would have. And so Bill Gates was like, well, let's talk to them and see if we can help solve that need. And so the source of inspiration was, came by way of a friend. And then it came by way of looking at what a, potential competitor or another person in the space was doing. And so it wasn't like this idea came out of nowhere. It actually came from other sources of information. Steve Jobs, somewhat similarly, he basically was friends with Steve Wozniak, who showed him a computer that he built. And he was like, we need to sell these things. And so his inspiration came from seeing something that someone else had created. Mark Zuckerberg, when he was, in college at Harvard, created a, kind of an early version of Hot or Not, which basically is like show two pictures and people can pick which one they think is hot, right? And to do that, he hacked into Harvard's Facebook system, it's pictures of students, and used that for his website. This ended up creating a bunch of controversy with Harvard, who was angry at him for hacking into their system. And so it generated some media coverage, at least in the local press. And one of the local newspapers, in response to that, said, there's actually a lot of value in creating a public version of a Facebook that students can view and access. And that was actually, a key source of inspiration for him for what then transitioned from what was at the time, again, Hot or Not, into Facebook as we know it today. What is the point? The point is that inspiration comes from exposing ourselves to different sources of information and being perceptive enough to notice and recognize and pick up on these ideas around us. For Bill Gates, again, it was what another company was doing. It was what was written about in an article. For Steve Jobs, it was what a friend was working on. For Mark Zuckerberg, it was someone's response to an early iteration of what he had done. So to overcome the creativity plateau and move into generate, you need to begin to operate at a level of thinking that's like a Picasso and actually come up with new ideas. Part of that is exposing yourself to different sources of information, diverse sources of information that can stir and stimulate ideas. Okay, well, let's now take that and do a deep dive on phase 4, generate. All right, let's jump into the fourth and final phase, generate. This is an exciting one because it has to do with creating and illuminating paths that weren't previously conceived of. In the last section, I mentioned that there were two primary processes for creativity. One of those is kind of what we think of as a eureka moment. An idea just hits you. It's a moment of illumination. And, when we think about that, I would refer back to what I just shared about Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and Mark Zuckerberg, that the key there is exposing ourselves to a diverse range of stimulus, things that are outside of our normal world, because those will stir new ideas. Another example, I was coaching someone who works for a big, kind of drilling, oil and gas drilling supply and services company. And she was or is, kind of an emerging leader. And so we were talking about, how do you come up with new ideas? How do you, step into this land of generating creativity? And what I ended up working with her on was saying, okay, where are sources of inspiration that are tangentially related to your world that you might be able to draw some new ideas from? And so we looked at things like, okay, well, is there something that can be learned from looking at medical surgeries? Because there's an aspect of drilling in, operating under the surface, needing really fine-tuned precision. So is there something we can learn from that? We also looked at, the topic around satellite maintenance and the way that companies work with satellites, because, they send a satellite up into space and then they have to maintain it remotely. And some of what they're trying to do is around drilling rigs of how do we maintain this remotely and, limit the amount of downtime. And so there you can see what I basically did was I said, okay, what are the characteristics or features of the work that you're trying to do or the problems that you're trying to solve? And then where can we find examples of that in totally different spaces? Because they might have come up with a solution to it that we can learn from or receive inspiration from. So there, the key is exposing yourself to different but somewhat related information. The second process of creativity is one of persistence. So you come up with an idea, but it's not quite there. And so you kind of keep refining it, and you keep refining it and refining it and refining it until finally it gets there. And in the book Imagine by Jonah Lehrer, he talks about the story of the creation of the I Love New York logo, which is worldwide known, and how that was a process of, I think, months of refinement until there was kind of a eureka moment at the end when the artist was in a taxi, and it kind of finally came to the point where it's like, so this is it. But sometimes that's how creativity works, is that we come up with something and then we refine it over a period of time. And the key there is to not allow yourself to have a threshold that's so high for perfection that you never put anything out. You never put anything on paper. You kind of just keep it all in your head and you're like, I'm just going to keep working until I get to something that is perfect, because that will thwart your creative process. We can think about two strict tips or strategies that can help. The first is around the question that you're asking. So say, for example, that I were to ask you the question of, how can I get across town? That might prompt certain answers and certain thoughts in your head. Now, if I were to change that question and say, what are the different modes of transportation I can use to get across town? That's going to cause you to think about different things. Now, if I were to say, what is the fastest way I can get across town? That would cause you, yet again, to think about some other ideas. And then if I were to ask you, how will people get across town in 50 years from now? Again, that's going to prompt different ideas. And so what you can see there is that just by changing the question that you're asking yourself, you can change the ideas that you're generating. So if you're working on a question, again, critical thinking is developing a robust answer to a question. So that's what it's all about. So if you're working on a question and you can't come up with an answer to it, think about changing the question. The second tip around this is to dive into the atomic details of different aspects of the question. So for example, if I were, the Zarvana example, how do we objectively measure the productivity of people? Well, when I just asked that, you might be thinking about a variety of different ideas. But what if we were to say, okay, what does productivity actually mean? And we actually dig in there and we say, okay, productivity means this. Or what does it mean to objectively measure? And what are we talking about when we say that? And when you double click into these words, it actually helps provide insight and inspiration into the answers. When I first started my journey into productivity, actually we had a similar question, me and a coworker who were meeting every other week to talk about productivity. And for 6 months, we really made no progress. But then we said, okay, the first thing that we need to do is define a metric for productivity. And in the consulting world or knowledge worker world, that that's hard because it's not like we're producing widgets and we can say, oh, well, I did 50 this week and 40 next week. So we were really stuck there. And then what we said is, well, how would we define productivity? And now I would define it differently than we did then. But what we said then was productivity is a product of 3 factors: quality of the work, quantity of work, and the time it takes to do the work. And so we said, okay, so if that's the 3 factors that determine productivity, then let's start with quality. Well, quality we don't really need to assess in our context, at least back then, because we said, we get performance reviews, we get feedback from our managers, so that's already taken care of. We'll know if our quality is slipping. And then we said quantity. The quantity of our work, if you look at any given day, sure, it's going to vary. There's going to be fluctuations in that. Even from project to project, there'll be some variations. But what we said is, if we take the quantity of work over a larger period of time, so rather than a day, let's look at a week, and then we follow the trend over the course of even a longer period of time, months, that over time, that should be roughly average. Roughly the same, in terms of the quantity of work over the course of a week. And so there we were able to reduce the complexity down to, okay, what if we just measure the hours worked per week on project-related work? And that proved to be a really powerful metric that ended up setting us on a course to dramatically reducing the hours we were working. And it all started with saying, what do we actually mean by productivity? And that's a tactic that you can use to help stir creativity, is double clicking into the atomic details of one of the words in question. Once you come up with an idea in the generate phase, it's important that there is a process of ongoing creative exploration. And this is where hypothesis testing comes in. So this is the 4th and final phase of the critical thinking roadmap. We've gone deep in a lot of areas. What I want to do now, before we get to question time, is present to you a really exciting opportunity that can take what we've done here and go to a whole nother level. All right, so I'm confident that should you even take a few of these practices that we talked about today and apply them consistently as habits in your work life, in your life, more broadly, that you'll notice a difference. And here's the thing, great critical thinkers always distinguish themselves wherever they go because they add value in any circumstance. Great thinking always adds value. And many of you, I'm guessing, you'll take what we discussed here today and you can apply it. You can use our productivity app, which takes a number of these behaviors and can help you turn them into habits and ensure that you actually stick with them and ingrain them. So you can try that out for free if you're not already using it. But I think that there's probably a few of you who are saying, I don't want to just be a great critical thinker. I actually want to make critical thinking my legacy, my distinguishing characteristic. I want to be known for great critical thinking. That when people will meet me, they say, oh, wow, this guy is a genius. This guy is so bright. And they want to know my opinion and my perspective on things. If that's you, we have a special opportunity because we're forming a critical thinking mastermind group that is going to meet over the next 6 months, starting in 2020. Here's how that's going to work. We're going to have an initial call where I'll do some teaching on critical thinking, and then we'll do some activations to just to get to know each other and also to engage and stretch our critical thinking skills. But then once a month from there on out, what we're going to do is have an hour and a half call. The first 30 minutes, I'm going to do a deep dive training on one of the skills or other skills that we talked about today. This will be presenting the latest kind of research and findings on these topics. Then in that next hour, what we're going to do is we're going to have two of you who are in the mastermind present a key challenge or problem or question that you're facing. It can be in your work life, it can be in your personal life, it doesn't matter. But what we're going to do then is, a half hour each, and that group is going to employ the Socratic method, asking questions to help push your thinking on that topic to a level that I'm sure you haven't experienced before. And so not only is the person who is presenting in that moment going to get to learn and grow by experiencing people pushing and questioning their own thinking, but it's also going to be an opportunity for everyone in the group to practice those skills that really refine our thinking. So each person will have an opportunity to be the focus of that time over the course of 6 months. But on top of that group time, I'm also giving you access to me, call, text, email, constant access, which basically means anytime you have a problem or question or a challenge that you're having trouble figuring out the answer to, I am available to work with you through that. And why would I do that? Because I actually want you to become an exceptional critical thinker. There's a list called the Thinkers 50 list that has a list of the top contributors of management ideas in the world. And my hope, my goal is that the people who belong to this critical thinking mastermind group would end up on that list. And so I'm invested in your success. And I want to be available to you over the course of that whole 6 months for anything you need around there to help push your thinking. And last, we're also going to be creating a private LinkedIn group for these 12 members where you can be sharing questions, ideas, thoughts with others who are wrestling with these similar challenges and who are committed to pushing your thinking to another level. So you'll be part of that as we do this mastermind over multiple times over the course of the next few years. We'll be adding to that group and forming this really exclusive group of people who really are invested in becoming exceptional critical thinkers. So this is an early opportunity to get into that and be part of an exceptional group of people. Also, at the end of every hour and a half session, there'll be a set of exercises that you can take and then apply over the next month between those two sessions. So that's what the Critical Thinking Mastermind group is. We're only opening it to 12 people because we want it to be small, intimate setting, really immersive, where everyone is really actively contributing. But in doing that, we're able to offer it to you at what I think is an amazing value. So if we were just to think about the value of this, so over the course of those 6 months, there's going to be 3 hours of custom training that I'm going to be providing, a half an hour per session. Actually, it'll probably be a little bit more than that. And that's a value alone of $3,000. Now, on top of that, there's going to be facilitation of 6 hours worth of small group sessions, that mastermind group. That's a value of $900. On top of that, this constant access that you have to me, imagine that you even just take advantage of it once a month for a 1 hour call. Those 1 hour coaching calls add up to $1,350 for 6 of those over the course of 6 months. You're also going to have access to the LinkedIn group, which I don't even know how to place a value on. That total is a combined value of $5,250. What we're going to do is give it to you at a rate of $1,900. And so this is an amazing value. And we're only taking 12 people. We want this to be small this time. And so we're going to open it to the first 12 people that can be a part of this. But we're really excited about this. We've been dreaming about this for over a year of how can we develop and help create exceptional critical thinkers. And this is where we've landed. And we're basing it on the research of what the research shows forms critical thinking. And that is mentorship, dialogue, and immersion in authentic problems. And so that's the Critical Thinking Mastermind group. If you have questions about it, send us an email. You'll see information on the side of the screen here. And we would love to be part of your journey towards exceptional critical thinking. All right, well, let's now turn to some questions that you all have.